to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. This is the place where you get both a coach's and sports dietitian perspective on topics important to endurance sports, including nutrition, training, and how these impact and fit into your daily life both on and off the race course. Your host, Coach Justin, a certified run and triathlon coach and owner of Tabula Rasa Racing, along with Coach Katie, a registered dietitian with a specialty in sports nutrition and owner of Fuel to Run. Here at the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast is where your journey begins. Welcome to episode 2 of the Endurance Athlete Journey. I'm your host, Coach Justin from Tabula Rasa Racing. I'm the head coach and owner. And with me is the co-host, Katie, and she is the sports dietitian and owner of Fuel to Run. Today, in episode 2, we're going to be discussing forming a race day nutrition strategy. What are some of the things that you should be considering as you test out different nutrition strategies during your training as you prepare for your race day? What are some things that you have to keep in mind in terms of, carbohydrates per hour, calories per hour? What kind of intensity are you racing at? Compare that to the intensity in which you're training. The topic, the ever important topic of training your gut. How much fuel should you be taking in? Do nutrition strategies depend on the duration of your race? How does weather and environment impact your ability to consume calories and process those calories and turn them into energy? Do weather conditions impact your strategy? Do you have, a summertime strategy where you're dealing with hot and humid conditions versus a different strategy for cool temperatures with maybe, rain, or does that only impact your fluid intakes? These are some of the important topics that you have to consider when forming a race day strategy. So, Katie, let's start this conversation. How are you doing, Katie?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I'm still frigid here in Colorado, but I'm making do on my treadmill. So that's, which is not the same for me as being outside, but I'm otherwise doing pretty good. I think what, I was kind of thinking of is maybe starting with just a little bit of our own like personal experiences with race day nutrition and kind of what maybe we're struggling with a little bit too, and bring in some of that, and then kind of go into maybe more of the topics that we want to discuss today, and sort of helping people figuring out their own strategy. I just bring that up because I feel like, having been a runner, I mentioned in our first podcast, since I was like 12, by now I feel like I have a pretty good handle on it, but I definitely have had, my own set of struggles with fueling in general. And, I think for a long time in, my first marathons that I did when I was in my 20s, I most definitely did not fuel enough. Like, I did not take in enough fuel. And that's aside from the fact that I probably started out too fast in at least a few of them, and that might have been a mistake. I definitely think my fueling was part of that, of like kind of hitting that wall at the end and, not being able to complete the, basically be slowing down significantly towards the last 6 miles or 6 miles of those races. And I think there's like a couple of things happening, but fueling is probably one of the big mistakes that I made. Kind of looking back on it now, I'm like, I wish I had this information, or somebody had kind of helped me with this, 15, 20 years ago when I got into it. And this is kind of before I even got into grad school and really focused on nutrition. So maybe that's partly why I went into becoming a dietitian, because this topic kind of fascinated me. But I know I've had my own struggles. And now, thinking back on it, I think the recommendations were 30 to 60 grams an hour. And now we're hearing, recommendations from or certain professional athletes doing much, much more than that. So I think that's where we want to, why we wanted to bring this topic in today and talk about it. But I don't know, what are your thoughts? Justin, any thoughts on this topic? Any of your own personal experience?
My own personal experiences. Well, first of all, nutrition strategies vary based on the type of event that you're doing. If I were going out and just doing, a run only race, or I'm racing
Mhm.
like a half marathon or marathon or something like that, my nutrition strategy is going to be very different than if I'm going out and I'm doing like a half Ironman, because, I'm going to fuel a lot differently for a run where I'm cycling beforehand. I'm able to preload a lot of nutrition before the run. So when I work with athletes, that's one of the things that we'll focus on is testing out these different strategies based on what we are doing. And
Mhm.
I know in my past races, I've made so many mistakes. I mean, it's just it's the dreaded like, oh, I overfueled or I underfueled. Most of the time in my early experiences in triathlon and other endurance events, I was underfueling, and I
Mhm.
think most of it was from the result of the fear of gaining weight. I didn't want to consume too many calories because I felt like I was defeating the purpose of working out. And so, I'd be like, you know, I would take a look at, my calories expended. It's like, oh yeah, I burned like 3,000 calories during, my 4 hour bike ride. And then I'd go and eat like this cheeseburger and like completely replace most of it. But I was so afraid of like taking in calories during the actual training or the race that it just, as I look back on it now, like 10 years later, it's like, man, that was a ridiculous, that was a
I think
ridiculous
it's like a common thing
concern.
that people do.
But I think it is common, and I
Yeah, it's
think
just like
that a lot of athletes is like, oh, I don't want to, I'm working out, and it's
mhm.
a different mindset of like I'm working out versus I'm training, and
Yeah, I
it's a
think that
very different purpose and mindset.
people who maybe had that weight loss, some sort of weight loss journey, or maybe they feel as though they need to lose weight and they're trying to train for something, I think that's a common thing that's like, oh, I if I take in these calories during my training, then I'm not going to have as much to like eat like later. And I think maybe there's also within that potentially that thought of like earning like, oh, I'm going to burn all this energy so I can eat more later. I mean, that might be like a deeper topic too of some skewed relationship with food in a way, but I think that's pretty common. And I think a lot of people kind of fall. I mean, when I'm thinking of of that sort of underfueling versus like overfueling spectrum, I honestly kind of run into more people who are underfueling, and not necessarily because they're wanting to like lose weight or they're worried about calories. They just don't consume enough because they don't know, or they are worried about how it might impact their gut. Like, oh, is this going to cause? I don't want to puke during my run. I don't want to have that I don't have the runner, the runner trot, the sort of things that sometimes happen when we have issues during our run in terms of having to go number two. So that does happen. I think a lot of people have fears around that. I know in college, like I was fearful about eating anything before my runs because I was so worried about having issues during my runs and not having access to a bathroom or something. So it's like those are things that are concerns that a lot of people have, and I think they're legitimate, and then we can talk about it a little bit. But I think I run into more issues with people not getting enough fuel versus the opposite. I very 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 rarely have an athlete that's like, I'm like, wow, you're consuming way too much during your training. You're
Yeah,
overdoing it. I don't think I've once said that to anyone. Maybe I've been like, actually, you're pretty good. You're doing pretty good. Like there's been a few times I'm like impressed with the amount that they're able to do, and they seem to have figured it out, but very rarely, if never, have I ever been working with someone that is consuming too much.
yeah.
So that's
I
what
had an
my
experience where I did that. I
Mhm.
think when I first started in in triathlon, I was effectively doing like a half Ironman with some water and a couple of these like generic little fruit bars.
Mm,
It's like
mhm.
a kind of like mushed fruit. I mean,
Right.
it's not even like
I think I know what you're
like
talking
a power bar or anything like that. Nothing
about.
with
Like
protein
12
in it.
grams of carbs or
It was
something.
all like carbohydrate and sugar. And
Yeah.
so I would effectively eat one of those, and
Oh, wow.
we're talking about like a 3.5 hour event, where I'm
Mm.
burning like 6,000 to 7,000 calories, and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I wonder why I could barely crawl across the finish line. But then I had situations where I signed up for a quote unquote nutrition seminar
Mhm.
with an elite, what I would call an elite coach here in my area. And this was years ago. And, they gave, this coach gave, this metrics, it's like, this is the number of calories you should be consuming. And it's some function of, your weight and duration that you're out there. And so I did the math and effective, I was creating like these 900 calorie bottles. And so I would go out on a bike ride and I would have this bottle, uh, just a regular like 20 ounce, sport bottle, but it had 900 calories in it, and it was like sipping on just straight glucose. I
Mm.
mean, it was like thick, and it was just not appealing. And if you go out for a 5 hour ride, I would have like two of those bottles,
Mhm.
and after testing out that strategy, I was gaining weight, and I was
Mhm.
like, this isn't working for me. I have a completely different digestive system than a typical like normal person, but also the intensity in which I was training didn't warrant that
Mm,
many
mhm,
calories,
mhm.
for that kind of duration. So,
Mm.
you see these calculations and these equations from elite coaches and what these elite athletes are doing, these professional athletes. You have to keep in mind that these athletes are going at such high intensities that maybe taking in that amount of calories and carbohydrates is warranted for
Mhm.
their body, and the expenditure that they're putting out.
Mhm.
But for the typical age grouper, we're not going out there and pumping out that kind of output where it warrants
Mhm.
that many calories, that many carbs per hour. So
That's a
nutrition is not a copy and paste plan. This
right.
is not
Yeah.
something where you just say, "Oh, well, a friend of mine is doing this, so
Mhm.
if it works for them, it's going to work for me." Or I'm going to copy and paste what this what this professional,
Right.
triathlete did at, Ironman, Kona or whatever. It's so unique to the individual and each person's requirements, the
Mhm.
intensity in which they're racing, their body's ability to absorb all of these, carbs and calories. That you know, just copying, like I said, just copying and pasting what somebody else is doing is just not necessarily going to work. It may work, and you may be one of the lucky ones,
Yeah.
but 9 times out of 10, it's not right for
Yeah, exactly, and I think you brought up a really good point about, like, the intensity is a big piece, like, yeah, when you're doing, like, zone 2, like, kind of easy training, you may not necessarily need the same amount of fuel as if you're doing, like, a higher intensity workout, so the intensity does matter, and, yeah, I think, you know, trying to do what somebody else is doing, it may work, it may not. I mean, sometimes I think another thing to consider is, like, just there's a lot of products out there, and if you're like, oh, this so and so is using this one product or this gel or whatever it is, the most fancy product, that's out there, that's expensive, and you try it, and maybe are you going to what if you don't like it? What if it has a weird funky texture, like something I've experienced with some of those products, and I'm like, oh, like, I don't know if this is gonna work, but so and so is doing it. So, I'm gonna try to force myself to do it. But when you're in the middle of a race and you're, maybe 3, 4 hours into an Ironman, let's say, and you don't like that product and the taste is kind of making you a little bit icky, like, you're going to run into some problems because it's going to be very hard for you to consume what you need to consume. So I think there's other things too, like taste, texture, like we don't want to force it, like what you're doing. Yeah, and in some ways fueling is a bit forced. Like it's not really natural to be like running a marathon and nobody wants to necessarily take in gels. Like it isn't something that, you know, is always easy to do, but it's like important to do. But when you're doing that, you should have something that you at least kind of enjoy, or at least sort of is taste tastes okay, you know, at least tolerable, you know. So if you're taking in something because somebody else does it but you don't like it, like there's a problem there too. Like it has to be not only tolerable for your gut but also for your taste and the, yeah, you want to at least sort of look forward to it, I guess. Like it doesn't want to be something you're like, oh, this is going to be awful, I hate this, it sucks. It The texture is odd or the consistency is odd or the taste is odd, you know. So those are all important too. So it's just kind of, I think the biggest takeaway there is just not following exactly what somebody else is doing. You know, you can take tidbits of what people are doing and try them out. But the biggest problem there is most definitely do not take what somebody else is doing and not practice it at all, and then get to the race day and decide you're going to do that thing, because you're not, most likely it's not going to end well for you. So I think the biggest thing I think I want to kind of dive into now is like, when you're formulating that race day nutrition strategy, it shouldn't start, the week or two before your race. This should be something that you're thinking about and kind of planning a little bit, like as you're planning your race, your races for the season. Like this should be something that if you have races coming up later this summer, spring, into the fall, like you're thinking about right now. And maybe you have experience, you already kind of know what products you like, maybe there, but if you have never sort of dived in, to this topic and you're not sure, this is really when you need to be starting to formulate that plan and not waiting until like you're a few weeks out from your race, because that's going to be a mistake. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
Yeah.
mhm.
When I'm training for an event, or if I'm working with an athlete who's training for an event, we start as early as possible. We're
Mhm.
talking like in the base period of training.
Mhm. Mhm.
If I have an athlete who's training for a like a half Ironman, and we're doing like a 16-week plan, we'll start toying around with nutrition in like week 2 and 3. I
Mhm.
mean, because I want all the time that I can possibly have to test out, a, what kind of products are we going to use, is one,
Mhm.
and two is the frequency in which we're going to use.
Mhm.
Um, you know, if I do a feeding schedule, like for instance, my feeding schedule for the events that I'm training for right now is I'll consume like a honey stinger waffle or a pack of scratch chews every hour. So
Mhm.
the question is do I consume that entire waffle within on hour on the hour, or do I take that waffle, cut it in half or cut it in
Mhm.
quarters, and consume half of it in 30-minute intervals?
Right.
And then I start to play around with the liquid side of it. So how is the liquid and the solids going to be mixing around in my stomach?
Mhm.
Or do I need a completely liquid nutrition strategy, like for a running only race?
Mhm.
Typically, I wouldn't recommend, a runner trying to consume, waffles and chews and all this kind of stuff while they're running, because it's a very different action.
Right.
It's jostling around a little bit, not to mention, the blood that gets diverted from
Mhm.
other parts of the body as it floods into the gut to try and process the nutrition that you're taking in, you know, that that might feel different running than it does cycling, just by
Mhm.
the sheer movement of the body. So
Right.
for a runner only, I may say, hey, we're going to use we're going to use a liquid nutrition strategy. Let's test this out, and we'll do some powdered calories.
Mhm.
There was back in the day they had this product was called Carbo Pro, and it's
No, I know what that.
basically just powdered calories.
Right.
So we would just add it to the bottles, and that was the additional calories that we would need to beef up the bottle.
I think
Um,
the hard part sometimes
so
that I do want people to think about is like on their during the race though, like how are they going to be carrying, for a runner? Like
mm,
what is your race? Like are you doing a marathon, or are you doing like an ultra? Like what is the race? Obviously you don't need fuel for like a 5K or 10K, or you know half marathons, maybe a little bit, but we could cross that bridge a little bit. But I'm talking like the races that you're really going to be needing this fueling strategy. Like, what are you carrying with you? Because I like agree, like taking something liquid is helpful, but for me, like I don't carry anything with me on in my race, so I have to rely on what's happening at the aid stations. And so I'm probably going to have to take something with me like gels or goos or something that I can consume while I'm running that is in my pockets, because I like some runners do take liquid with them in their handheld, or they have like a something that the wrap or a belt or something like that they're using, but some do prefer not to. So I think that's something too, is just how, as you're formulating your plan, like how during the race are you going to take in those calories? So if you're using liquid calories during their training, you have to find a way to do that during a race. And unless you're a professional or an elite, you know, um, you're not going to have those bottles out on the course like the elites do, like
Right.
it's something to consider, right? So I think it's like figuring out like, oh, what do they have on the course too? Like, is there something on the course that I can utilize, or no, I don't really, maybe you don't like what they're having on the course. You need to kind of do a little bit of your homework and thinking ahead a little bit, because those are all things to consider. And although I do agree that for running, like more easily digestible carbs probably are going to be the better way to go, unless you have a really good gut. It's going to be harder to do that if you have to know what you're going to be doing on the during the race itself. Like, how is that going to play out for you too? So those are just things, like I agree with you. I think taking an easy to digest carbs is gonna be good, but if you can't take liquid in because you don't want to have it holding on to it, how are you going to do it? Because I guarantee you're probably not going to get enough calories just with the Gatorade that they have on course. You
Yeah,
just
I mean that's an important point.
Mhm,
Is if you don't want to carry stuff and you want to rely on what's on course, then you have to know what they're going to have on course, and
mhm,
then practice consuming those products during your training. So that way
mhm,
you don't have to carry it. You can rely on aid stations. I've
mhm,
seen that completely backfire for athletes where maybe the race director didn't really plan all that well, and they ran out of certain products
mhm,
you were hoping to use. And so, what I typically will do is I'll tell an athlete, if you're going to use what's out there, know that there is some exposed risk,
mhm,
on whether the product is going to be available, the flavors that you like are going to be there, and that uh, I I would say go in with the plan of being self sufficient, which is how I typically will approach, because with my unique digestive system, from the gastric bypass, there's a lot of products that I can't stomach, and
mhm.
so I've typically relied on stuff that I've brought, or stuff
Right.
that I know can tolerate. If I'm,
Mhm,
when I did, like I think it was like Ironman Chattanooga, where I had never really tested, using Coke. It's a huge product that everybody loves to use, like during these long events. The
mhm,
flat Coke. You get the
mhm,
sugar, you get the caffeine, but during that particular race, they didn't open the bottles early enough, so they were still carbonated and still
right.
fizzy. And the way that my stomach doesn't handle carbonation at all, so it
Mhm.
completely made me sick. And I could only sip on it, and it just was not a good day. And
Yes.
the idea of training the gut, I think, is important.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
something, it's a very popular topic these
And
days in
yeah,
order
maybe we
for
can
you
dive into that too a
to train
little.
your body.
Yeah. Um, because I think that's a good point in a way. It's like you have to try different products to see what you like, but a lot of people tell me when I'm working with them, like, I can't fuel more than that, because when I have more than 30 grams of carbs an hour, let's just say, or I try to consume products more, or consume more carbs. Um, it hurts my gut, or I start to get gut issues. And it's like, okay, like that, when somebody's saying that to me, I think we need to assess it a little bit, because it's like, how, first of all, how much are you taking in all at once? Like, are you only fueling once an hour and you're trying to get all 30 to 60 grams of carbs all in at one time? Like, that might be an issue. Or are you spreading it out? Or what are you taking? Like, what products? Maybe you are taking in too much of something that contains, too much glucose or too much one type of sugar, and you are sort of maximizing your ability to absorb that. So it's kind of asking questions about like how often you're, fueling. But I think also there is a piece of it that your gut isn't going to be able to handle more if you don't try to push the limit a little bit and sort of get used to a certain amount. So, like, the way I usually go about it is I kind of have like a minimal, so I think of it as carbs per hour, not necessarily calories per hour. But I think, okay, a good starting point is like zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.7, grams per kilogram per hour, roughly, depending on weight. Like, that's where it gets tricky. Like, if somebody weighs more, like, obviously they're gonna, but roughly that amount. So for me, that's like maybe around 25, 30 grams of carbs, or maybe a little more. I don't, somewhere around 30 grams of carbs an hour. That might be like a really good starting point, but that's not my ending point. Like, that's just kind of where maybe I'm starting, and you're just sort of, okay, I'm gonna now that I'm in my base phase, I'm gonna sort of start picking some different products that I want to try. Like, maybe I want to try, maybe I don't like the idea of just taking in gels even though I'm running. I want to try some natural things like dates. Or I want to try like maybe I don't like the idea of these sports nutrition products. So I want to try some different things. Well, maybe I want to try like maple syrup, or maybe I want to try some of those other products that, say that they're um, more slowly digested, like the UCAN or the Morton gels. So, like, but this is the time to sort of trial it out and sort of start at a base minimum and just maybe try out different products during some of your longer sessions and just get a feel for what you like, what you can tolerate, and trying to at least reach that minimum per hour. And then as you get used to that and you're sort of figuring out what you like, I think it's like adding in more carbs slowly. But I personally am under the belief that more frequent fueling, the sooner you can start, the better. So if you're doing like a 3-hour run, you need to start at 30 minutes. Like, you're not waiting until 90 minutes to start fueling. That's another big mistake I see people doing all the time. Like, oh, I feel great. I'm not going to fuel. And then they get to 90 minutes and they're already starting to drag. And it's like, well, now it's too late. Like,
Yeah,
you didn't
behind
fuel.
the eight ball by then.
Yeah. So, like, sooner than later is better. More frequently is better, because basically you're just like, if your goal is 60 grams an hour, taking 30 grams at 30 minutes, 30 grams at 60 minutes, 30 grams at 90 minutes, that's just an example. But spreading it out a little bit better is going to be a little bit easier on your gut, so you don't have so much in your gut to have to like absorb all at once. So those are just some of my, like, but yeah, you kind of need to train your gut to tolerate it. Like, if there's a piece of it that you're going to maybe have to be a little bit uncomfortable in order to sort of see, obviously, if it's like every time you go and you throw up or there's something more serious happening, maybe that's a sign that that product isn't working. But it definitely is, a piece of it is just maybe you're going to be a little bit uncomfortable or feel a little bit bloated while you're running, or there's a little bit of a piece of it like, ooh, that, I don't know, like, that's just part of training your gut. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or Justin, but
Yeah, yeah, I agree 100%. Um, yeah, I am a big fan of more frequent fueling.
mhm,
Um, it kind of spreads the absorption out over a longer period of time, so it gives the body. It's kind of like, if you're sitting at a campfire, right, and you throw 4 logs on the campfire, and it may take a long time for those logs to catch. it may actually smother out the fire.
Mhm.
So I'm a big fan of like taking one log and throw it on the fire, let that catch, and
Yeah.
then throw another log. So that's the way I kind of view a
That's kind of
fueling
interesting
strategy.
because you could either have it
Yeah,
clear out or you could have, like, the fire just, like, explode, you know what I mean? All of a sudden, all this
I've
energy and
I've
you
had so many situations where a product where I use regularly may not work on a particular day. You know, I've
Mhm,
I've been out, on a long bike ride, and I like these scratch gummies. I mean, I have no commitment to them. I get
mhm,
no financial recourse from them. I'm not sponsored by them, but I like them. They work for me. I like their taste,
mhm,
and they're easy to handle. And so, one day I was out on a bike ride, and I consumed a whole pack in one shot. And I've done it before, no problems. And then I did it this day, and 30 minutes later, I get a little lightheaded, and it's the definite feeling of way my body reacts to a big dose of sugar kind of hitting the
mhm,
system, where I kind of feel a little sick to the stomach, I get a little woozy and lightheaded, and but I have strategies that I have that help me combat that. I know what to do when I feel that way.
mhm,
And in that case, I pulled out like a honey stinger waffle because it's got a different texture to it. It's not as sugary, and it feels like it kind of like it's a little bit more absorptive. Typically, what I'd love is like a peanut butter sandwich because I know that that's what settles my stomach. But I didn't have it that day. I
mhm,
think one of the most important things to the nutrition strategy is the experimentation, but b figuring out what to do when it doesn't work. I think that that is so valuable to where, if you say, you go out on a long ride or a long run, you consume a product and it doesn't sit well that day, you have to come up with a plan on, okay, if I do this on race day and I take in this gel or this waffle or whatever and it doesn't sit well, what am I going to do?
mhm.
And the way that I've explained endurance events to my athletes is endurance events is a PhD in crisis management. That's what you're doing. You're putting out all these little fires throughout an entire day. And if you're out on a half Ironman, which is anywhere between like 3 to 4 or 5 hours versus an Ironman where you're out there, 6 hours, 6 to well, 6 is a pro, but if you're talking about like a 12-hour, 13, 14-hour event, you're going to have a lot of decisions that you're having to make throughout the day,
Mhm.
and not everything is going to go well. There's going to be instances where, like, what happens if I drop a bottle, and I'm expecting to use that bottle, and I'm on the bike and I get butterfingers, or I hit something in the road, and I'm happen to be holding onto the bottle at the same time, and the bottle pops out or doesn't sit into the cage properly. What am I going to do? Do I go back and pick up the bottle, or do I wait until the next aid station? So it's all these little events and decisions that you have to make and figure out how to fix things that go wrong.
Mhm.
And I think that is a crucial,
Like
crucial thing that you gain from
right,
training.
yeah. And sometimes the longer the race, the more that
Yeah,
like an
yeah,
Ironman, and like, gosh, especially when you have those 3 different, you know, different sports you're doing, like, you're trying to with all the transitions, I feel like there's so much more of that with that sort of race than, like, obviously that happens in a marathon to some extent. You're kind of constantly, like, you're putting out some fires, but it's definitely more so in, like, that sort of event where you have the 3 different disciplines and the transitions and the bike piece where there's so many things that could so that's so I think some reasons why people love that sort of race and some people maybe don't. But yeah, I agree. It's like,
for
you're gonna
any of
have
your
times you feel
for any
great.
of your marathons, have you ever had an experience either during training or during a race where something just something involved with your nutrition strategy just did not work, even though you
Yeah.
practiced it and you had all of it ironed out, where you had to execute Plan B.
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably not so much in my marathons because, you know, I feel because I knew what I tolerated and nothing, luckily nothing, other than maybe just like a little bit of discomfort. Like, you know what I mean? Of maybe like I'm racing and you get to the end of the race and you're trying to take in gels and you have that little bit of like gut discomfort that you're kind of like, hopefully this doesn't progress, into anything more serious. But, you finish like maybe a little bit of that. But I would say more so in my ultra merit, like I did that 50-mile ultra. And basically for that race, I was meticulously I had even created my own little pouches that I made with sweet potato and like various other things that I made to take during the race. I had my whole like strategy sort of planned out for that race, like it's meticulously, and it all. I had a race vest with my water and all of my fuel, and I learned because I never done that sort of race before, so I I got sort of into it, and I realized that um, I just didn't feel like some of those things that I brought at like 25, 30 miles in. And I had to rely a little more of what I felt like having on the course, which was available, like watermelon with salt, ginger ale, lots of ginger ale. I think even at one point I grabbed like a handful of Fritos because they just sounded so good. So like that's that's the only time where it wasn't so much like it was negative. I just got to this point where I'm like, these like pouches I created with sweet potato just did not sound good at all. I was like, and they might have sounded good like when I was training and doing like up to 30 miles, but like at the point where I was going beyond that, my body was like needing something different. And in that case, it's kind of like this, like you shouldn't try something new on race day. And typically you shouldn't deviate too much. But in that case, I was trying to let what sounded good, like within reason, dictate what I was going to eat, So I think that's the only time I'm like, did not follow through or had some sort of change in my strategy. I had to sort of shift gears a little bit, um, you know, to, I'd never had Fritos. That was probably could have been a mistake, right? It could have maybe ended badly, but I was like, I know I need the calories, and this sounds so good to me right now in this race. And of course, it's a low intensity. I'm not in a marathon where I'm like putting as fast as I can go for 3 hours or whatever. It's a little bit different, but that's probably the one situation. So I think that's also brings up a good point, is that you could have like the best plan ever, but you do have to sometimes shift. And maybe that shift is like, oh, something you're consuming doesn't sound good to you, even though you practiced it over and over again in training. Like it just doesn't sound good, or it isn't sitting right. And maybe that is a situation, you do, you know, deviate a little bit, or but I don't generally recommend trying something different that you've never tried. But at some point you kind of have to, sometimes make those shifts. So and hope hope it's going to turn out, because I would rather had the calories than not had the calories in that case. And I ended up doing really well in that race. But I think the thing I'm trying to say is you could plan everything out and have this perfect strategy for the whole time, and then run into some issues with either gut or palatability, or something just not seeming right or sounding good. And sometimes you have to kind of pivot or deviate a little bit. Yeah, I don't know, that's just an example from my own, the only ultra race that I ever did. So
Yeah, I had a similar situation when I did Ironman Chattanooga. It was my first Ironman, and I was done with the first loop of the bike route. The way that the bike route was set up, I don't know if it's still the same. It was just like this lollipop. So you'd leave from downtown Chattanooga, and you'd go out and you'd do these loops, and it was these two loops, and then once you finish the second loop, you come back down into the downtown area. And during the second loop, my stomach shut down, and I
mm,
couldn't figure out why. And I was like, I've trained all this time. I've done these rides. I've done the duration. I've done everything, and I'm using the same products I used. And it was just it was just the day.
Mhm.
I still don't know what happened. I don't know if like I was biking at an
Right.
intensity that I wasn't used to, and so my body wasn't able to manage the nutrition at the same time, or it was just was it the
Was it
temperature?
was it, like, hot? Because that could be.
No, not really. I mean, it was warm that day, but when I was out on the bike, it wasn't like overly hot. It was like that day it got up into like the 80s, but it
Mm,
wasn't until like later in the day. So I mean, we're talking like maybe high 70s, maybe low 80s. But you know, I live in Virginia, and
right. So
so I
you're
was
used
like,
to
I
that.
trained all summer long in the humidity and the heat and everything, and so I knew how to handle that. But for some reason, excuse me, that day just didn't work well.
Mhm.
It's like then you're just like, okay, well, I've got probably 8 more hours, 8 more hours to go. Let's see how this works.
Yeah.
There was another race where I did Ironman North Carolina, and it was a 70.3, so it was a half Ironman. Uh, I had some struggles like training for that one. I had some health issues that were coming up. I had flare ups of gout, kidney stones, and everything else. So the training was just a hot mess for that race. And then we went down there, did the race, and I got off the bike, and I knew that I was holding back intensity for like the swimming bike because I just didn't feel conditioned. And so I went out on the run, and I had my liquid nutrition with me, and I took one sip of it and knew instantly. I was like,
Mm,
this isn't what I want.
right.
And unscrewed the tops and just dumped it onto the ground because I was like, I don't want to carry the weight. I'm not going to consume it.
Yeah,
So, then I had like a half marathon to try and figure out how to do that without any kind of, electrolyte
issues. Yeah, that's
nutrition.
tough. I would say,
So,
like, yeah, I would say when I did my half Ironman, it was hot. It was, like, 90 that day, and
yeah,
at the run portion, when I finally got to the run, it was, like, high 80s, maybe low 90s, and that I did have to pivot because, my gut wasn't like, I think the heat definitely impacts your ability, to absorb and just everything. It kind of impacts everything negatively. And so that's when I did rely on, you mentioned Coke. I
yeah,
remember being like getting to the aid station and they had like these flat Cokes. I think they were cold. And I'm like, give me that because I just knew I needed the sugar. And I'm like, I've never tried that before, but I knew for the most part, I would probably tolerate it as long as I didn't guzzle like a whole bunch too much of it. And that's kind of what I ended up relying on the last like 6 miles of that half Ironman, so like the half marathon portion. And I think sometimes you do have to kind of be able to pivot, but I think that's where it is helpful to try different things. Like even if you don't like, I kind of makes me think like even if you don't plan to like if you have a race day strategy, but maybe getting your gut used to, occasionally using like a liquid, nutrition for a run or so, just to like be able to know you if you have to rely on that, you have the ability to absorb it. So you're not in the middle of the race like freaking yourself out and worried about issues, or during an ultra marathon. Like that's probably a situation that I'd never been in because I'd never done a race that was that long before. So it was like in my training, if I were to when I plan to do another one, it'll kind of be like maybe I will try more like solids and like get my body a little more used to that instead of sort of thinking I was going to have these more things that bars and gels and gummies and pouches that were all kind of unappealing to me at a certain point in the race. So I think that's where you learn like and you learn from your experiences, but you also maybe you have your strategy, but maybe there is something in even trying like a strategy where you in that case like eat something more solid and then go for a run, like
free fuel.
eat
Yeah,
uh, a sandwich. I don't know, like then you kind of like it's like you're training your gut in a different way to be able to be a little bit uncomfortable on solid foods or so there can be I think bringing in some of those for some of those longer distance run races like Ironmans or ultras where there is so many variables and your plan it's like with the best intentions can sometimes unravel or change, and to be able to sort of anticipate that and do a little bit of that sort of thing in your training might be helpful. So oh yeah, my gut's not doing so well. I'm going to rely on more liquid calories from here on out. In the remainder of my marathon, I still have half a marathon to go for my Ironman, but I know I can rely on liquid calories at the aid station because I've tried that, or I've done some of that during my training. So I do think that kind of brings up a point too of like it's like managing like you're almost like training, but then I think part of the training in a way is also bringing in, if you're able to, some of those fueling related things that could possibly come up in almost training your gut or training to be able to handle certain situations that maybe you have run into, or you might run into in a race, so that you can handle it without totally, or you're going to be okay, or you can handle it without it kind of getting to you mentally, or or maybe messing up your gut because you've sort of practiced it before. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that brings up a point.
Yeah.
Like,
I think training the gut. I mean, I think you're trying to tell it to get it used to consuming calories. And
mhm,
one of the important factors that I think to this process is during your training to put in some race pace efforts.
mhm,
So if you're going out on a long run, say that you're going out for a 2 hour to 2 hour and 15 minute long run, right? And let's say that we're going to do let's say 20 minutes of easy zone 2, zone 1 to zone 2 warm ups, and then we're going to do some race pace efforts. So let's say 4 by 10 minute race pace efforts with 5 minute zone 2 efforts in between as your rest period, and trying to consume those calories during the race pace
mhm,
efforts so that you're teaching your body how to absorb that and take it in
mhm.
under stress. I
Right.
think what happens is that a lot of us will go out for our long runs or long rides, and it's all zone 2, but we
Mhm.
don't race at zone 2.
Right.
So when you get to race day, you're like, I've practiced my nutrition strategy and I've got it. But now all of a sudden, your body is under so much more stress. You're forcing it into like zone 3 now, and your body's like, oh, wait a minute. I've been supplying your muscles with all this blood, in order to withstand the demands of the event itself. But now I have to divert that blood to your gut, and now you're going to be developing cramps.
Mhm.
You're starting to this so-called bonk.
May
But
have like a bathroom
the
issue.
bonk isn't from the result of like underconsumption.
Right.
It's the over intensity
Right.
that your body wasn't used to in training, and
Mhm.
so your body wasn't able to absorb any of the nutrients that you had practiced during your training.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's like it's like you have to practice the fueling in sort of some sort of simulation of race day.
Yeah.
So yeah, on those harder, so even I think it's even like for me, I'll do it on some of my long runs when I'm practicing some marathon pace training. That's a really good time. But even some of my typically I do not recommend people fueling. It's not necessary to fuel like on anything less than 90 minutes. The exception to that, I think, is if it's like a high intensity workout or something that's going to be really close to race pace, or you're really pushing yourself. It might be in that situation you're practicing your fueling. I mean, maybe you're not doing it every time, but I do think there's some validity in like practicing your race day strategy, even if it's like a 90-minute or 2 hour workout. And technically you don't need to be taking in 60 grams of carbs an hour for that, or up to 90 grams or whatever you're sort of trying to aim for, but you want to practice it. And that I think is an example of a time when, yes, you probably would benefit from taking in some fuel during those workouts. Whereas, like, if you're doing a 90-minute or 2 hour zone 2 training session, you probably don't need to be taking in any fuel, or at least maybe not as much. But I would say, to to utilize some of those harder sessions, even if they're a little bit shorter, to practice the strategy is a good idea for that very reason. To
Yeah, I
be
think
able
there's other
to,
strategy. There's other times where you're kind of just going out for that 90-minute zone too, like you said.
yeah,
I think
you're
that's a
not.
good opportunity to work on, metabolic efficiency.
Yeah, exactly. That
Trying to teach your body to use the glycogen stores and the fat
yeah,
stores that it has,
that brings up a
you know,
good point. Yeah,
there rather than trying to fuel it. And so it's always used to receiving something and never learning how to use what it has. But that is not a strategy to use every
right.
single time for every single type of training event and every kind of
And that
race.
might brings up a whole, almost like a whole other topic we could talk about, is kind of like the whole within the fueling piece. I think it's important you bring up a good topic of like knowing kind of, it's hard. It's sometimes really hard to figure this out. So this is why working with like a dietitian or a coach can be helpful, because they can kind of help you figure out what workouts to sort of, to not, you don't need to fuel for this workout because we want to be working on your metabolic efficiency. We want to be working on fat utilization, but you do, these workouts we want you to fuel, because it can be kind of confusing, I think, sometimes to know. But you bring up a good point, is that we don't, like, we do want to be able to train our body to efficiently use a little bit more fat for fuel too. We don't want to be only burning carb and needing to consume large and huge amounts of carbs to be able to make it through our workouts and our training sessions and our races. Like, there's a balance there. And so we do want to do some of our training in that zone 2, and maybe not, up to a point, up to maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours, and maybe in some very, certain cases, maybe longer than that, but probably not, like where we don't fuel, because we are in zone 2 and we are working on helping our body be more efficient at burning fat. So there's like, I think that's where it gets tricky, is kind of knowing when and what times to focus on fueling and when not to. And, I think that's where bringing in somebody to kind of help you out if you're not sure can be really helpful, because otherwise it gets a little bit tricky, because, and that's a whole other topic, is that sort of metabolic efficiency, metabolic, like being able to adapt between fat burning and carb burning, and, being able to utilize more fat for fuel, obviously up to a certain intensity. But it's just, yeah, that brings up a whole, I think, a topic we'll probably discuss at some point later on, because that's its own topic in a way. But, I know,
I'm learning how to drop these little teasers on things that
yeah, there we go. We got we got that one coming. I
discuss.
think that is one of the topics that we did put in that we want to talk about, because I think that is
One
another.
one thing that I would like to bring up and to get your
Mhm.
perspective on is we've been talking this entire time about fuel, right?
Mhm.
So we're consuming some kind of product that has calories and carbohydrates and maybe proteins to a certain extent. My question to you, as a dietitian, and you kind of understand how the body operates a lot better than I do. How important is the what I would call like my fluid strategy? Like just
Yeah,
the consumption of water
that's
in
a
terms of
I think that
managing real estate in the
yeah.
stomach and
Yeah.
giving your body the fluids that it needs
Yeah.
so that it can process what
Mhm.
you're taking in.
That, I think, is a maybe its own topic, as well as just like the hydration piece and kind of how to fit the two together. But, I think the thing we want to keep in mind is that, um, sometimes the products you're taking in are very concentrated, and so that can be hard on the gut on its own. So that's why sometimes, like goos or certain gels, they recommend that you take some fluid with it, because it basically, so not necessarily electrolyte, but just something, I mean, it maybe could have a little bit of electrolyte like a Gatorade, but something that's fluid, that's like going to help, n decrease the high concentration, that sort of bomb of like sugar and carbs in your gut. It kind of dilutes it a little bit, so that it maybe doesn't cause so much of that GI distress, because it's a little bit less concentrated. So it maybe, takes a little bit less to absorb. You're not you're maybe minimizing some of the gut issues, although I don't think that's necessarily true. A lot of people can take in goos and gels and be just fine without fluids. But I think sometimes if you want to be careful about taking in, it's all about absorption. So if you're taking in too much like electrolytes and sugar and things that need to be absorbed in the gut, and there's like a high concentration of, I guess, solid, of like carbs or different, what I'm like thinking of the word for this, but like sometimes the gut, it's like overwhelming to the gut, especially when we have a lot of like sugar in the gut, or especially like just pure glucose or pure fructose or something that's like not being absorbed very quickly. Sometimes the gut will actually self like kind of want to dilute that. And so that's sometimes when somebody might have issues like diarrhea during a race or something, because maybe their body is trying, like, this is a very concentrated amount of carb and it will flush some fluid from the gut, like from the external tissue kind of into the gut, and it will cause sort of this like need to use the restroom, almost like similar to dumping, like in a sense of what happens with sometimes bariatric patients, but that can actually happen sometimes somewhat during a race for some people. So we do want to be a little bit careful about, that's why we want to spread out the carbs. That's why I think taking in a little bit of fluid with some of these products can be helpful, and probably why we don't want to be like pounding like a very sugary drink and a goo at the same time, or maybe we want to take our electrolytes in a little bit separate, but I think that's the whole hydration piece, I think, is something we can touch on almost in a separate topic, because that is itself is like part of the fueling, but not exactly.
Yeah.
It's almost a separate thing. And I know I unfortunately do have to get going today, but I hope this is helpful for people. Like, I hope, and we can always revisit this, make it, another topic if people want to dive in more to the fueling, or if they want to, chat. I mean, we didn't talk about other things like ketones, or there's like a whole world out there that maybe we didn't touch on. I think this is kind of like a basic, like, these are sort of our thoughts and our experiences, but we're always happy to kind of dive into some of those topics, I think, in more detail, if people are interested in more of this. So
what I'll do is I'll tell the listeners
do you
how
want me
they can drop some of these ideas and questions that they may have. We have created a Facebook page that is dedicated to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. You can go on Facebook and just search for the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast, and you'll find the Facebook page for it. We also have a group that is dedicated to the podcast as well, and that's called the Endurance Athlete Journey group. I don't know if the word podcast is in there, but it might be podcast, but it's got the word group at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
You'll just answer one simple question, agree to the rules, and then we'll let you right on in. And so those are two locations that you can find and keep track of what's going on with the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. We also have a dedicated Instagram page that you can search for. It's going to have the same name in it as well. So please check us out on all of our social media platforms, as well as Fuel to Run. And that's FUEL with the number 2, run.com for Coach Katie's page. Or you can go to tabularossaracing.com, which is my website, for all coaching and nutrition information and programs that we have as coaches. Katie, thank you so much. I had a good time talking with you, and we hope that you've enjoyed episode 2 of the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure we'll chat again soon. I'm not sure what our next topic is this time, but it'll be something interesting, I'm sure.
Yeah, so keep an eye out, and we'll drop little teasers on what the next episode is going to be. So stay tuned.
All right. Bye, Justin.
All right, talk to you later, Katie. Listening to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Feel free to leave us up to a 5-star review on iTunes and Spotify because leaving a review really helps others like you find us. Visit the podcast website for other episodes of the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast at enduranceathletejourney.buzzsprout.com. Have questions or comments about the podcast? Send Coach Justin and Katie an email at theenduranceathletejourney@gmail.com. For all things coaching, visit Coach Katie at fuel2run.com and Coach Justin at tabularossaracing.com. Again, thank you for listening to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast, and remember to find joy in the journey.